Welcome
Yes,
to Book
it
Passage. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and supporting your local independent bookstore. And before we begin, if you can check that your cell phones are off, that would be a huge help. My name is Monica Golden, and I will be your host for this evening's event. Book Passage is delighted to welcome author Amy Scheibe and her new book, A Fireproof Home for the Bride. Fireproof is a classic coming-of-age story featuring an 18-year-old girl who becomes swept up in a family secret when she attempts to step outside her parents' rules in order to follow her heart. Set in 1950s Minnesota and North Dakota, the novel captures a time when women's roles were being rapidly redefined. A recent Star review from Publishers Weekly said, "The multi-layered plot feels organic. The strands are knitted into a tight story of substance that touches on the politics of race, class, and gender. Overall, the book is spectacular." Born in Minnesota and raised in North Dakota, Amy currently lives in Manhattan. Her first novel, What Do You Do All Day?, was Amazon's #1 women's fiction pick for 2005.
Wow.
Please give a warm welcome to Amy Scheibe. Hello. Hello. I know you can hear me, so I can hear Monica just fine. Usually the way I do these things is I talk for a few minutes and then I will read a little passage and then I'll take some Q&A because I know you all have lots of questions, especially that one over there. Oh, there's my other friend. Hi. So about 8 years ago, when I had finished writing What Do You Do All Day, I had, I'm going to have to scold my husband. He's going to be as bad as my mother was in the audience. They were chit-chatting, back talking. I just did like 4 days in North Dakota, Minnesota, and my mom, she's so lovely. But she has this muttering thing she does because she's not always right, but she's never wrong. And if there's something that I say that isn't quite right, and I'm a fiction writer, she will, under her breath, say, say it straight. But at a decibel that only I can hear. No one else notices this. So about 8 years ago, when I finished the first novel and it was published, my mother was in town visiting and having breast cancer surgery and was staying in our apartment for a number of days. And I had begun to think about what I was going to write next, and I had come across some different inspirations, but I needed a time period in which to set the book. I didn't want to do it in the present time as the first one had been, because I really didn't want to write in texts or emails. The first book kind of edged right into the text generation. And I didn't want to be hemmed in by having all of that technology in a book. And I thought, let's take it back in time. And my mother was telling me all of these stories because she was becoming a little bit nostalgic. And my father had been dead for a couple of years. And I thought, well, she's always said she's wanted to write a book about her family and she wants to write about herself. And she's never going to do it because she's not who she is. And that's okay. But I started saying, well, why don't I do it? So I started taking some of her stories and knit this much larger story around her life. And as I was doing it, I was doing a lot of different research, but also looking into family history and began to really understand the deep connection between, in particular, her mother and her mother's sisters and all the generations below them and how they've influenced us, including my cousin Lou, who is the daughter of one of those sisters, and what proto-feminists they were. In a time before there were feminists, they were taking on careers and opportunities that a lot of women didn't dare do. And I think that just set the tone for future generations, and I wanted to honor that. And there is a character in the book who is an amalgamation of 3 of those women, 4 of those women, although the fourth is sort of split off into her own character, which is my grandmother. How many of you have actually read the book so far? Okay, so I won't do any spoilers. The piece I'm going to read is, of course, I have to lighten up my iPad because my children like to put it on dark. And I can't read it because my eyes aren't 8, 9, 10 years old. And here we are in the wrong book, even though I set this up. All right. It's okay, I still love you. Sort of. That was it. So the piece I'm going to read is, Emmy Nelson is coming of age. She's 18 years old. She has been raised on a very Seer Lutheran religious Minnesota farm where everything is very prescribed. You don't drink, you don't swear, you don't dance, you don't play cards. You go to church, you go to school, and you marry the person that your parents have decided for you to marry. And that's okay because you've known him since you were a kid, and that's just everything you've always known. But Emmy's father, because of his work, has to move into the town of Moorhead, which is next to Fargo, North Dakota. And in this process, she has now gone to a bigger school, and her intellect and her aspirations are being widened by this occurrence. And the point that I'm reading, she has actually, let me see, she's now engaged, and she has just helped pull a calf in the middle of the night. And through this engagement to Ambrose, she has realized that this may not be the life that she is driven towards. So she has some questioning. But more than that, this piece is about Emmy and her mother and their relationship, which builds into the story later. So I'm just going to read it, and if there's something you don't know, you'll have to read the book. You want to know, like, what did that mean? I have to read it now. Okay. The sun had not only risen, but was about to set when Emmy awoke hours later. She'd slept upright in a large winged chair next to her grandmother's bed, an American history textbook splayed out across her lap. Rubbing her neck, Emmy remembered that after she had bathed and washed her hair and left the rest of the daily farm chores to her family, she'd come in to try to catch up with her languishing homework, reading perhaps 2 pages about the Battle of Gettysburg before she dropped off into a blissfully dream-free sleep. Emmy yawned and stretched her arms over her head. It couldn't have been much later than 4 in the afternoon, but she smelled onions frying and heard the subtle noises of a table being set. Lyda was sitting up with a half-eaten bowl of milk toast on a tray by her side. The old woman was staring at Emmy, and it gave her an odd start, like falling within a dream. "Good sleep?" Lyda asked. "Well, yes, more or less," Emmy said, feeling a dull ache at the base of her back, where it had strained against her unnatural position. "How are you feeling?" "Better. God is good to me." "Are you hungry? Do you need me to help you finish your meal?" "Oh, I've eaten. How was the calf?" "Oh, wild," Emmy said, moving the tray over to a table and settling lightly on the edge of the bed. She took Lyda's hand in hers and was pleasantly surprised to find it warm, but not too warm. It had been cold since the stroke. On impulse, Emmy felt her grandmother's forehead, but it was papery and cool. The old woman smiled sleepily. "You are so much like Josie was at your age," Lyda said, stroking Emmy's cheek. "You have her hair and her eyes." "Tell me, who's Josie?" Emmy said, putting her own hand over the one on her cheek. It was still warm, but she felt a strange chill. "Shame," Lyda said. "We were once so close." And with that small, teasing statement, she fell into a shallow sleep. Emmy was amazed anew at her grandmother's ability to do this neat trick, start a fire and then throw sand on it in the same breath, even though Emmy understood well that there were certain things in life that adults knew and others that were shared with children. It wasn't unusual to discover a piece of information that had seemed not to exist in the moment before it was issued. A decade before, she'd gone with her mother on a long train journey to a grassy graveyard outside of a small town north of Minneapolis. She had stood next to Karin, beside a freshly mounded grave, the rich black soil showing slick pink worms that had made Emmy's feet twitch inside her tightly laced shoes. She was desperate to be back at the creek fishing with Grandfather Nelson. There had been no marker on the grave to offer Emmy a clue, and she hadn't asked Karen where they were going or why they were there, because at that age, Emmy knew that the answer would likely be, "You'll know when I tell you." She had heard those words enough times to think them already etched on her own tombstone. Emmy had watched her mother's tightly closed eyes and folded hands, her lips moving in a wordless prayer, at the end of which Emmy had heard Karen whisper, "Goodbye, Father," as she turned and walked away with her head still bowed. They'd gone back to the train station, waited quietly for the return train to come, unwrapping cold roast beef sandwiches from their damp papers and chewing in silence. In Emmy's experience, this was how information was shared, sparely, and without the luxury of further commentary. Lyda's bedroom door opened a bit, and Karen poked her head through the gap and motioned for Emmy to come with her. Once in the hallway, Karen looked up at Emmy, holding her by the arms and smiling. "You've grown so much," she said. "I'm pleased with you, Emmy, I really am. You don't know what it means to us that you are marrying Ambrose. He'll take good care of us." Emmy shrugged her mother's hands from her. "Who's Josie?" she asked, testing her right to ask questions now that she was considered an adult. Karen's face closed like a screen door in a high wind on a hot day, snapping to, yet still revealing the cool interior unchanged by the weather. "What did she say?" Karen asked with a nod at the door. "Not much, just something about love and that I look like Josie, whoever she is." "Your grandmother once had a sister," Karen said plainly. "Don't trouble yourself or your aunt about it. Come. Or about her about it. Come." Emmy hesitated, wanting to ask more questions, yet knowing that the answers wouldn't unlock her mother's firm hold on their family's history. Karen didn't believe in the past, only the future. It had served her well through more than one tragedy, and Emmy had no choice but to respect her mother's desire to find distance from what she called painful, pointless nostalgia. Besides, dead siblings were not uncommon. Emmy had one herself, after all, and it was easy for her to imagine one day saying something about Daniel to her own granddaughter, folding the information into a tossed-off story of, "There once was a boy I never knew." Karen led Emmy down the hall to Lyda's sewing room and opened the door. The lights were blazing in the narrow room where the old foot pedal singer sat in front of a bay window that looked out on a wide field during the day. Next to the cutting table stood a dress form, and on that form were the makings of a formal white gown. Emmy raised a hand to cover her mouth. Karen gave her a small push forward, and Emmy saw her mother's reflection in the darkened window, tight-lipped smile slightly turned up in a way that made small pockets of flesh push downward at her jawline, hair grayer than Emmy had taken time to note. Karen was willowing away at a rate that made her seem much older than her 40-some years. Emmy walked to the dress. It was a ghost of the garment it would become, with an underslip of silk covered in a veil of homespun lace across the high-necked sweetheart bodice. The skirt was pinned to the mannequin, the yards of supple rayon peau de soie gathered and hemmed at T-length. It would accommodate a very large crinoline or perhaps even a loop. Her mother must not have slept much the previous week by the looks of the amount of work already finished. Emmy had never imagined Karen had this much lightness in her. "It's stunning, Mother, really," Emmy said, but couldn't bring herself either to touch the garment or turn away from it. The white of the fabric was like the snow outside, cold, harsh, and beckoning with its icy perfection. "I'm glad you like it." Karen bowed her head. "I'm not much of a seamstress, but I want it to be as perfect as God will let me. Tell me if there's anything about it you don't like so far, and I'll change it." Emmy knew that her mother hadn't worn a wedding dress. Women during the Depression were lucky if they had a new suit, and Karen hadn't been particularly lucky, not for many years. "Oh no," Emmy turned to her mother. "Don't change anything. Do exactly what you think will look best. It's already perfect." She went to Karen and held her by the arms, as the older woman had done to her moments before. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, thank God," Karen said, evading the embrace and going over to the dress as she slipped a small threaded needle from the front of her house apron and clicked a thimble-covered thumb against her front teeth thoughtfully. "You're going to make a beautiful bride." Emmy looked around the room and noticed a wooden chest that had been painted a soft blue with swirls of delicate flowers, stems, and leaves interwoven in harmonizing dark blue, red, and cream colors. The top leaned open on its hinges, revealing a good deal of folded linen stacked inside. Embroidered with red thread onto the dusky blue cotton fabric lining the lid were the letters EBN. "Mother," she said, approaching the trousseau as though it were a casket, "why is this already so full? Isn't it lovely?" Karen turned her attention to the box, lifting a lace-edged sheet and smoothing an undetectable wrinkle with the edge of her hand. The Brons had it made in Norway years ago. We were thinking that since your grandmother is ill, it would be best to have the ceremony as soon as school ends. Were you planning on consulting me? Emmy said, a snap in her voice. Karen stood straight. I just did. Now go downstairs and help Bertie with supper. That girl burns everything she touches. Emmy backed out of the room slowly, trying to undo the time that had just run past her and tied down her future more neatly than the stack of lace doilies she tipped over as she bumped into a small table. She turned and left them scattered for her mother to collect, no longer able to deny that this path forward promised only more of the same disregard for what she wanted. And that was a lot dimmer than I thought. There's funny stuff in there too. But one of the reasons I wanted to read that passage is because one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations of the book and reviews is the notion of secrets, and how there's so many secrets in this book, and how sometimes people, especially on the East Coast, say things like, I just don't believe that she wouldn't know that her grandmother had a sister. And my feeling is, especially post-war, there were a lot of secrets because people were changing identities and leaving things behind and trying not to get caught up in things they didn't want to admit. So I like that there's all those secrets in there. So if you have any questions, yes.
How did you come up with the title?
The title, I was on a little book tour for the paperback, and I think I was here during the paperback also, but I was up in a bookstore in Portland called Powell's, and they have a number of things in their store beyond books. They have some antiques, and in a certain corner they had tear sheets, these giant tear sheets from old magazines, and there was one from Ladies' Home Journal or Better Homes and Gardens from the 19-teens, and it was a house sale sheet. So it had a picture of a Spanish mission-style house that was made out of concrete, and it had the pictures of the rooms and the pictures of the floor, and then it had the floor plan, and then it had this title, A Fireproof Home for the Bride, and I thought, wow, they have to advertise that this woman cannot be touched by anything in this house. And to me, I mean, some people read it and they go, oh, the title is so, I thought it was going to be a romance. It's not a romance. To me, it's about that claustrophobic feeling of being married off at 18, and somebody builds you a house and puts you in it. And then you have children. And there's nothing wrong with that until you wake up screaming in the middle of the night. I don't know. So that's where it came from. And it is revealed in the book. Why? Yes. So, lady in the back, who I've never met before.
Yeah, you sound like a really good writer. Tell us a little bit about how you began to have an affinity maybe for the milieu of this. I know you talk about it being autobiographical, but it is so different than contemporary to the ear, and in contrast to your last book or to your day-to-day life.
It's true, and it's very little of it is autobiographical, and there's no real characters except for Dot, Helen, Irv, and Ginny, who are based on real people, which is my mother and her family. And they're pretty true to who they are in the book, but they don't do anything bad. So I can't name characters after real people if they do bad things. That's what I find. But as far as the milieu, what I did was I immersed myself in books and music and movies to start. So Marjorie Morningstar was something I was reading at the time that I started writing the book, and I just went head over heels for that book. It was one of those books that you read fast, slow, right? Like, oh, I can't wait for more, but I gotta slow down because it's only 700 pages and I'm gonna get to the end and I'm going to be so sad. And when I got to the end, I don't know if you've read it, but I was so disappointed in the ending because the character doesn't get the life she imagined. And I felt, I want to write a feeling like that. I want to, she has all these different types of love in this book, where she's got the father love and the first boyfriend love and the expectation love and then the wild love. And then I wanted to do that, but I didn't want to spit her out into a relationship that she settles for. And so that, movies, music, And then I did a lot of archiving in North Dakota and reading up on things, and there's a lot of oral histories that I read up on, and I also had to read back a few years, and then that led me into, spoiler alert, the KKK material that we came across, and then I needed to go back to the 20s in order to understand that generation and how it would push through to Emmy.
Yeah, there's a lot, there's a lot of constructing that world before you even put your characters in it. So.
Right, before, and some people say, ooh, it took me a while to get into it, and I feel that's true about any book with a large narrative. It takes you a while to get into it, and then when you're in it, there's no letting go, and you just throttle down, and that's what I wanted to do. So, 50% of people love the way the pace works, and then there's some people who are a little annoyed at the slowness and then the rapidity at the end, but that's just different tastes, and that's okay. I don't mind that. Questions? Yes?
Who are your favorite authors?
I have a lot of favorite authors, and it really depends on the day, and I more have favorite books than I do favorite authors. Few authors I will run all the way through. Stephen King, I ran all the way through when I was younger. William Faulkner at a period in my life. William Kennedy had a real hold on me for a while where I couldn't read enough of his books. And then I went into the Kafkas and the Camus and into all the French existentialism for a while, which I'm sure my children love about me. I don't know why I shot them. The sun was in my eyes. That's a Stranger reference for those who haven't read it. So as far as, I don't read a lot of modern stuff because I just don't have the time. But I hear there's a lot of really good books out there. I wish I read Ishiguro because every time he spits out another book, I think, it's just too late. It's too late. I went to the back room and there's a big poster. I'm like, I know, I'm supposed to read you and love you and Murakami. Yeah. So it's more book to book than author to author.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. I wonder if you might say more about Midwestern Lutherans.
Well, let me start by saying I'm not Lutheran. I was raised Presbyterian by a half-baked Catholic Lutheran and a Congregationalist into Presbyterian. But the family that's charted through this book, there's two different families, and one of them mirrors more my own background, which was my mother's branch of the family that came over as Catholics and quickly became not so. The Lutheran part I chose because of its pureness, and it's in the Norwegian part of it, but also how that hemming in was easily manipulated by the people who did come out with the KKK and look into these small churches to find their constituency. So that helped with that. But there's both, there's good and bad in every type of character and religion in this book. I tried not to make the Lutherans the bad people, because they're not, except a few of them.
Yeah, does the editor in you look back as you read the book and say, maybe I would have made that sentence?
I was reading a passage today that I was going to read, and I found something in it that perturbed me so much that I decided not to read it. I used the words immigrant grandparents twice within 3 paragraphs, and I thought, who let that happen? And I literally could not read it tonight because I was like, I'm gonna have to edit it while I'm reading. So yeah, it's hard as an editor to write because I edit as I write. I'll write something and I'll think, that is horrible. I gotta go back and rewrite it, and then I finally just have to say, just write. And this book went through over 60 drafts. And by drafts I mean full, don't get scared, Sloan, full on, front to back, from the first draft to the last one, including the copy edit, full drafts. And even in the last major draft, the penultimate draft before it went into copy editing, I added a character and then had to change. Well, I didn't add him, I beefed him up. He was just this little tiny part in the beginning, and then I needed to split off a part of another character's personality in order to make the book work. So I took that piece of his personality and wrapped it around this guy, but then I had to bring him back. And I had to insert him into 3 or 4 more scenes. And I had to change his name because he had a good person name, a historical true person's name, but then he became a bad guy. So I had to give him a new name and find a bad guy name to give him. So, yeah, it seems simple, right? That's when I love that 1-star review that says, seems like she just wrote it overnight. Oh, yeah, I did that.
These were 60 of your drafts
Yes.
before you even gave them to an editor?
No, I think, well, my agent is my editor, and she read different pieces all along the way, and I think that she really inserted herself around 50, like number 50. I mean, she read a lot in between then. I didn't even know it was that many until I brought them up on the screen at my kids' school and was like, how many drafts do you think it takes to write? Wow. Wow, let's count them, shall we? And some of them were minor drafts, but some of them, I would guess between the first draft and the final draft, I probably wrote another 700 pages that were either in there or taken out of there. The full chapters were, the prologue, for instance. The prologue was the thing I first wrote. It was this thing I was darling in love with. It was a letter from who was going to become Emmeline to her supposed daughter, whose name was Josephine. And it was a letter at the end of her life explaining all of this that had happened. It was sort of a dive into the book. First person, then we go to the third person, right? This was my concept. I was wed to this concept. And at about draft 45, my agent said, about that prologue. And I said, yeah, what about that prologue? She said, and I had rewritten it at least 6 times too. She says, I just don't know if it's working. And I said, you know what, you're right. It's not. It's not, because the character as I had imagined her when I wrote the prologue was someone who was contemplating suicide. And Emmeline, as she ends up as a character, would never contemplate suicide. So that just tea-kettled the whole thing. And I had to come up with a completely new way of getting into the book. And one which I hugely prefer. So you just don't know till you know.
Would you write it and then set it aside and then read it again? I mean, did you put space between these drafts?
Oh, always.
Yeah.
Yeah, I put space between sentences if I can. Yeah, nothing I like better than a nice big chunk of space between drafts. Like, yeah, I'm just letting that cook over there while I go and watch a movie or coffee with my friends and pretend I'm working. Yeah. Yes.
How did you find your agent?
We worked together at Knopf.
Oh.
When I was first out of college, she was working for Sunny Mehta, who is the head of Knopf, and I was working for Peter Gathers, who still works with Knopf, and so is Sunny, and we were both editorial assistants. And then along the way, I wasn't writing, and she moved on to another house. She went to Little Brown, where she discovered The Lovely Bones, a book you may have heard of. And then she went off to become an agent straight out of there. And then her business partner was a friend of mine, and I wrote the first book. I wrote 25 pages one weekend, and I sent it to him saying, do you think this has any merit? And he said, I don't really get the mom thing because I'm not a mom. Let me have Sarah read it. And Sarah and I weren't really good friends or anything, we just knew each other. He said, let me have Sarah read it without telling her who it is, blind. And she read it and she said, who is this? I want this. And then when he told her it was me, she's like, yay!
Yeah.
So, yes.
Did you give your drafts to other readers?
Yes.
And then would they mark on them and say, I like this? And did you ask them to do those kinds of things and then take it back and reflect on that?
Well, it's always a tricky thing as a writer looking for reads, because when it's super early on, you give it to the person who's closest to you because they'll be the kindest. And that would be my husband. And he was like, this is great, you can publish it tomorrow. Let's just get that money coming in, babe. This is good. Oh my God, this is so
Good for you,
good.
Yeah, we're done here. It's good.
We're done here. She doesn't publish it, I will. Yeah, and then you start to trickle it out to your next round of people who you trust to give you opinions that you will agree with. And it's sort of, it's about you feather your nest, because, it's just you and the characters, and you don't want to hear that they aren't working. So, then I had a round of friends who were all very gentle, but also all gave me very good input. And a lot of things in that draft just went like, don't kill this character. Why did you kill this character? Please bring them back. And why don't you kill that character? I hate them. And, I don't believe this and I hate that, but I love this. And so little by little, you kind of shape it with that. And then I gave it to my agent who came in with a machete. But she doesn't really come in with a machete, and this is my friend Sloan, and we share the same agent. She just finished a massive draft on a fabulous book, and she's terrified because Sarah now has it. And I don't want to say too much because she has every reason to be terrified. This is how Sarah, who is divine, and she has many, many successes under her belt at this point. She'll read it, she'll take you out for a drink, and she'll go, it's so good. I just really want you to think about what it is that Emmy wants. Okay. And when I think about what Emmy wants, what am I supposed to do with all the writing around Emmy? And you'll see what I mean. If you just every chapter are thinking, what does Emmy want? What does Emmy want? What does Emmy want? Where is her? Where is her? Her. Well, where is her essence? I don't know. It's not there. I can't help you. If you sit there with a notebook and you write things down, right? Because you're a professional. You're like, this is good. I'm getting good stuff. And you go home and you open your notebook and it says, where is her essence? And you just start crying. I don't know what she means. I really didn't know what she meant. But I pretended like I did. And I acted like a big girl. And about a week later, I called her and I was like, I have no idea what you want me to do. I don't know what you want me to do. But I figured it out eventually, and then wrote another draft and gave it to her, and and then she was a little more. Then she got her hands in it like clay.
Yeah.
But she was ultimately the things that she told me in retrospect. I can go, she's absolutely right. And there's still things that she said at that point that we fixed that people in reviews call out, which is very interesting to me. But yes.
How does a writer feel then that it's not really their book? It's a collaboration between the editor and you.
Oh, they hadn't even gotten to the editor at that point. I think that any writer worth their talent and time is overjoyed at the collaboration, at the help, because it really is like putting on makeup without a mirror. Okay, I know where my eyes are, but I'm not sure where my eyeliner is. It's essential. And I used to edit Anne Carson, who is one of the most wonderful poets ever, and we had a long conversation about the editorial process one night, and ultimately she said I was the only person who had ever dared to edit her, that everyone was too afraid to ask her questions or push her more. And she said, I feel that genius happens in the space in between people, not in people. And without someone else pulling that genius out of you into the light where you can see it, you don't know where it is, and you kind of clutter it up with everything that isn't genius. So,
except that the old classics, they never had editors. It was what it was.
It depends on what you mean by old classics, because Dickens definitely had an editor.
Oh.
He wrote serials. And most of the books were written in serial form, and an editor helped him along that whole process. Yeah, and I think anyone that says that they write without any help is probably not telling the whole truth, you know. Yes.
Your agent is your editor.
She's my first stop, but I also have an editor.
I was just gonna say, with
Yeah.
another professional
I
editor
do.
outside of the agent.
I do. Yeah, and you know, and the thing is, they push you to be better at what you're trying to do. They don't tell you this character is mucking up the whole book. They'll say, is this the right character for this scene? And can you go back and look at that again? You know, I was an editor for 15 years, so I also know the edit speak, and I'm very happy to have people edit me, always. Yes.
Just an observation, it's not really a question.
Mhm.
In reading the book, it's, I mean, I grew up during that era. I was younger than Emma, but not much. And I grew up in the East Coast, but I could so totally identify with it. And I think it was quite genius how you could capture that, because you're not that generation, and you got it.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was pretty amazing to me.
Well, before I had every other editor, I had my mother, and she read every draft, and she's my fireproof wall, because if it can't get past her, it's not going to pass muster anywhere else. And the thing is, people say to me, how is it different writing for a Midwestern audience, meaning your core story, than a East Coast audience? And I say, well, you have to get overly correct for the Midwest because they care more about the specifics than they do about the story. I mean, they love the story and they want the story, but one thing's wrong and they'll shut the book. They will shut the book. Oh yeah, yeah. And I've heard my own family talk like that. Oh yeah, we read that book by that woman, and she said Napoleon was east of Jamestown. Southeast. Oh. Yeah.
Whoa.
Oh no, it's tough, and even in the reviews in the Midwest, you'll see that they review it differently. It's all about accuracy. It's all about, oh, she really got it right. Except she called tuberculosis consumption, and by 1958, nobody was calling tuberculosis consumption anymore. And I replied, oh, but it was Josephine who said it, and she was talking about someone who died in the 19-teens. So she had a reason for saying it, and I knew, and I looked that up specifically. Do you want to see my notes?
But the secretiveness, I mean, that existed all over the country in the 50s.
Definitely. Definitely.
I could tell you stories,
Well, I'd like to hear them. I'm writing another book.
It sounds so similar. I mean, it was so much shut down, and it's amazing how you captured it so beautifully.
Thank you. Well, I also feel like it's not even so much that the secrets are held tight. You just don't know them because they don't talk about them. Like, I didn't know my father was born a Catholic until I was at my great-grandfather's funeral in my 20s, and we were at the Catholic church, and I said to my mom, why are we in a Catholic church? And she said, oh, your father's Catholic. You don't know. And I said, no, I don't, no, I didn't know that. And she said, yeah, when we got married, it was a big issue because, the mixed marriage thing, and I was Lutheran, or I was Protestant, he was Catholic, and back then some people were disowned if they married a Catholic, and we were talking about this recently, and she says, well, he wasn't really, I don't know why you keep telling the story that way, because he wasn't really Catholic, and I never told you that. I told you that he was baptized Catholic, but he was confirmed a Lutheran, and then when he was in college, he went to synagogue with a Jewish roommate. This is like 2 weeks ago, I'm like, and I never knew any of that either. She said, well, you never asked. It's just that feeling of you never asked. And then it was actually fun being home because I met some relatives who were much more gregarious on the other side of my family. And apparently my great-grandmother, which would be my father's mother's youngest sister, just died. And she was 109.
Wow.
Yeah. And so they were talking about Aunt Marie, and that there was Margaret, and then, about Anne, and how in the 30s when she lived in LA, she was hanged by her policeman boyfriend who tried to make it look like a suicide. I was like, okay, can we slow that down? Can we just, what was her name? Can we take that a little slower? Because that's really interesting,
Yeah. Oh, that reminds me.
right? That reminds me of so much.
Yeah, it does.
I said, no, I never heard that one either. Mom was like, oh, you didn't know about the whole thing? No. And then she's worried. She's like, I'm really nervous about how my cousins are going to think about this book because there's so much in it that's about the family. I'm like, not really. Not really. And you know what? We all knew that Effie and Ray were cousins. This wasn't a secret to our generation. It was something that we celebrated that they were cousins. But to her, she's like, well, I don't know. Okay. I mean, Lou can attest to this.
I just wonder who those boisterous people on the other side of the family were.
In where?
Well, I'm just feeling a little, you know. You're
Secrets
talking
from
about
you, Lou.
these other people you met on the other side of the
Oh,
family.
no, that's my dad's family.
No, that's what I mean.
She hasn't met them.
We're coming out not so great.
Oh, no, yeah, that just gets into the whole city mouse, town mouse thing. We can talk about that later. Yeah, country mouse. Yes.
Did you meet the 109-year-old lady?
I never met her, ever. They moved, it
What
was,
wonderful stories she would have had to tell.
I know, I'm a little, they all moved out to, I think it was Santa Barbara, many, many years ago. The three younger aunties, and I never met them, ever. And the older sister lived 105. So she only died a few years ago. Oh, my grandmother lived to 98, the one that I knew. Yeah, so I was 20-something when she died.
I was going to say, let's do better financial planning.
Yeah, better financial planning, buy more books.
You're going to be around?
We have,
Have you started working on another book?
I have started the research on the next book, and the nice thing about having this one published now is this real fear of it failing and needing to get going on the next thing so that I can convince myself that the next one will work. When you publish a book, it goes out of your hands, and you do everything you can to publicize it and market it, and it's all going really well, and I've got great press, and I'm really happy about it. But at the same time, there's this thing in your gut, like, it's gonna fall off a cliff, and they're gonna be, shipping back the copies. It's really gloom and doom, but after this, I'm going back to New York, and I'm gonna start actually writing the next one. So.
Is that historical as well?
It is. It goes back in time from this one to the 40s, and it takes the character Jim Klein and his sister Elise and their life, and then it also goes even further back in time to Africa. Yes.
At the outset, you mentioned you didn't want to put it in the present because of texting and emails.
Mhm.
Is that a real problem in narrative? You're dealing with?
I think for me it's a problem in narrative because when I read anything that's contemporary and they don't text and they don't communicate through emails, it drives me crazy because we all communicate that way. And I find it really hard to get into something that is trying to artistically skirt that because it's not real. And a lot of people do it really, really well. But I just don't find, I don't find excitement in that, I find much more interesting things in the past and creating a world that isn't what's going on now. But also taking issues that are very much today and showing how they're the same exact issues back then, which if you've read the book, you can figure out what I mean. And if you haven't, then you should. And then you'll know, just like, oh, this is what she meant, the immigration. Yeah.
I was wondering, how do books involved with the library in our small town? How do libraries choose the books that they carry, especially the recently published ones?
Every publishing house has a library sales department that is dedicated to reaching out to librarians and library branches. And they also, the library system has conferences that they go to twice a year. And at those conferences, all the booksellers show up with their galleys and they press them out. And I know that my galley was pressed out in January at the big library convention in Minnesota. And then you just hope for the best. And another way they do it is the library marketing people, they're all on Twitter. All the librarians on Twitter. If you want to have a really good time on Twitter following people, it's the librarians, because those people have a lot of fun. They're really, really funny. And my marketing person gave me a list of librarians to follow on Twitter. And we don't interact a lot, but they see me. Some of them have friended me, because I can be a little funny too. I can hang with the librarians. So it's all that. I mean, social media, this is the biggest thing that's changed since the first book was published, is the way that you can connect to people now. This room would not have this many people in it if it weren't for social media. I really don't believe. You can tie yourself closer to people, and it's cool. It's very cool. And people can find you and can ask you questions, and it's much, today I was on Facebook, and I saw that Ann Packer, who is a Facebook friend of mine, we are friends. She has friended me back, so we are friends, but I've never met her. She had posted on her website that today is her book launch night, and she is in Menlo Park. And of course, I dialed up Menlo Park. I'm like, oh great, everyone's going in. Packer's event, south of the sea. Great. So of course I posted, congratulations. I'll be at Book Passage. And she's very sweet. She's like, I love the store, good luck. But if I didn't know that, then I wouldn't know that, and she's really real. I like her. Yeah.
I buy a lot of books on Amazon and my Kindle and my iPad. Every book I pull up has 4 or 5 stars. Who are the critics? Does Amazon do that just so they can sell books?
Not at all.
No?
Amazon does a couple of different things, and you should always buy Book Passage and then buy it on Kindle so you can carry it with you. Just giving a shout out to people. What Amazon does is something called Amazon Vine. And Amazon Vine, anybody can be a Vine member. You have to post a number of reviews, and then they start to send you free product as long as you post a review. And Amazon Vine publishers send out specifically to the top 250 Viners and hope that they'll read the galley and not just put it on eBay. So with my book, you can slice both ways. It's a total crapshoot with Vine. You can either get massacred and 1 star, and the same thing is on Goodreads. There's a Goodread leader readers that they send out to that I do not know these people. You can get massacred, or they can hold you up like the second coming. And I've been very fortunate on both. And I got a couple of 1 stars from the Viners, but then I went over and looked at Ann Tyler's School of Blue Thread, and she got a lot more 1 stars. And I know that's a good book, so I just comfort myself with the fact that people who get 1 stars are 1-star people. And that's what they like to do. And if you go click through to look at what other reviews they've given, I mean, they're giving Schick razors 1 star. They get all these free products, and they're giving Pampers 3 stars. But it's I think it's better to go to, if you're looking for good reviews, to go Goodreads. I think is a little bit better, more honest, I guess. Any more? 1 more? No? Okay. Well, I'm going to sign in a second. If you are all...
Yes. No, thank you so much, Amy. This has been